nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prananatha padasarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Kathamaham Payurasho Mudake Lato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Krishna Chandraya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Dhyāto'si Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilasha Tibalashvavara Shri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami bhajano lasamanasanam Shiradhaya sahasara smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasam me Chittam Satam Nirupa Madhukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilaga Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Pradavishaya Jat Sukyad Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padāmbhoje Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikilaga Sanga Shamani Shotratritim Sangata Ya Swadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Brajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Sajiyad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So, by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we'll absorb ourselves in Padyavali. And we're here in the Dainyokti Prakaran, the section of expressions of humility. And we'll continue with, we won't finish it today, but we'll continue with the remaining expressions compiled here by Sri Rupa Goswami. So in the last class we came to verse 67. So I'll just reintroduce that and then we'll look at the commentary on that in the remaining verses. So, the compiler cites an expression of humility arising from the experience of struggling to control the restless mind, based on the understanding that the state of one's mind is the determining factor in whether one is progressing towards liberation or proceeding further into bondage. So a few citations that demonstrate this. First from the Maitrayaniya Upanishad. Only the mind of human beings is the cause of bondage and liberation. a mind attached to objects of the senses, vishaya, is known to lead to bondage, and a mind free from objects of the senses is known to lead to liberation. So this statement can be taken in the context of the Jnana Marg or the Bhakti Marg in a broad way. In the following statement, we get a statement of śrī-kṛṣna in the Bhagavatam, speaking specifically regarding the Bhakti Marg and himself. So this is a well-known verse. Vishayan dhyatas chittam vishayeshu visajyate mam manusmaratas chittam mayeva praviliyate. That a mind meditating upon the sense objects becomes greatly attached to the sense objects. A mind continuously remembering me becomes completely absorbed in me. So where we fix the mind both determines our trajectory, where we're going, so to speak, as well as what the mind acquires the conditioning to remain engaged in. In other words, when we spend whatever we absorb the mind in, the mind will retain the tendency and the habit to further engage with that. And if one has the unfavorable situation of having a mind conditioned with samskaras for things other than bhakti, then this constitutes the majority of their problems, if you will, in bringing the mind into focus upon bhakti and upon Bhagavan. So there's a verse here from the Vishnu Puran, which is cited by Jiva Goswami in his commentary on the Sindhu, which says, "For one whose mind is absorbed in the sense objects, absorption in Krishna is very far off. Can one attain an object situated in the west by going to the east?" No! So by saying absorption in Krishna is far off, one sense is that it's a very different thing, and two, another sense, perhaps a deeper sense, is that it's going to take a long time to get to that point. In other words, if one's mind is readily absorbed and has already the conditioning to be absorbed in mundanity, then for it to gradually overcome those samskaras related to the mundane, such that it becomes actively and meaningfully absorbed in Bhagavan, that's going to take some time, or that's not necessarily going to be easy. So that, you might say, is an undertone of the expression. So what we have now is a statement of humility from a bhakta who experiences this struggle, or who has this unfavorable samskar of whatever varieties of affinity and conditioning related to some of the myriad of experiences and objects of experience within the realm of samsara, such that when they try to focus the mind upon Bhagavan or upon the Krishna mantra or Bhagavan's name or various acts of bhakti, they find that the mind is restless and it's difficult to focus it there. So here, feeling a sense of unsuccessfulness, a sense of lowliness, a sense of an absence of bhakti, all these different ways that dainya has been defined in our earlier discussions, then this prayer is expressed for someone who's feeling that as to how they can approach this difficulty that they feel with the unfavorable conditioning of their mind. So the prayer is as follows. Bhavodbhava-kleśa-kaśā-śatāhataḥ paribhramann indriya-kāpathāntare niyamyatāṁ Mādhava me mano-hayas tvad-aṅghri-śaṅkau dṛḍha-bhakti-bandhane. O Mādhava, with the tether of firm bhakti, please hitch to the post of your feet the horse of my mind, which is being beaten hundreds of times by the whip of the sufferings produced by saṁsāra, as it runs wildly down bad roads of the senses. So when the mind, due to its material conditioning, keeps running after sense objects, especially nefarious ones or sinful ones or ones that are contrary to bhakti, then one undergoes suffering as a result of that, the way a horse gets whipped as it, remains obstinate and untamed. So he prays, may my mind be hitched to your feet with the tether or the tie and the rope of bhakti. So in other words, attachment or affection is often likened to a rope or a bond. So may this attachment or this devotion to you fix my mind upon you such that it doesn't go anywhere else. So let's look a little further at what's implied in this prayer. The commentator explains that the comparison of the mind to a horse is made with the intent of alluding to the difficulty of taming it. No explanation needed. I don't think. That one I think we can easily relate to. When the author prays to Bhagavan, please hitch the horse of my mind to the post of your feet. Then Bhagavan may reply to test the author, well, why not let this self-willed horse of the mind roam about everywhere? Why subject it to the hardship of being tied up? Being kind, I will let it roam free. In other words, normally keeping an animal tied up all day is considered cruel, or at least somewhat cruel, and not ideal. And so, in a testing way, the commentator is interpreting it like this, that Bhagavan's saying, tying up an animal all day, why would we do that? Let's be kind to the animal. Let's let it run free. So the author replies, this horse of my mind is being beaten hundreds of times by the whip of the sufferings produced by saṁsāra, as it runs wildly down the bad roads of the senses. Meaning, as a result of running after bad, that is, troublesome objects of the senses, it is suffering severely. Thus, letting the mind remain free will not lead to protecting it from hardship, but rather only result in perpetually undergoing hardship. One who cares for it will thus not let it roam free, but rather restrain it, so that it cannot continue to act in a way that leads to harm and misery for itself. So we might also refer to the instance of a child. A child may not know what's good for it. It may run here and there out into the street or off near a cliff or, in various places and object and express discontent when attempts are made to restrain it, to hold it back, to not let it do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And the child may not understand that restraint being imposed upon it by the parent is actually good for the child and actually necessary for the child and actually far better than the activities that the child wants to do. But until the child matures and understands that, it will resist, or it can resist, that restraint imposed by the parent. So the mind is a bit like a child in that it roams all about and it just wants to do whatever it's conditioned to do. It doesn't want to necessarily listen to the dictates of the intellect, or the buddhi, which is being guided by the shastra. It doesn't want to, shastra means a tool for governance, or in other words, it doesn't want to come under the governance or come under the taming process that's been designed for it, laid out in the shastra, taught by the guru, and so forth. So it resists. But although it resists, we shouldn't give in to that resistance, because allowing it to quote-unquote be free won't actually lead to it being happy, but lead to it only perpetuating a state of suffering. So there has to be imposed upon it a temporary period of lesser satisfaction or temporary inconvenience or discomfort or unwelcome state, such that its conditioning can be adjusted, whereafter that sense of imposition will be removed. And thereafter, it will naturally engage once the samskara for bhakti becomes predominant. Then that same natural tendency that it may have to run away from bhakti, as it may appear in the case of some, will actually, that very same drive of the mind will work towards bhakti at that stage when the bhakti samskara is predominant. So, thus it's kind and supporting of the mind to restrain it rather than to let it run free. The commentator also offers the following purport, quote, "Severe suffering on my part is also occurring along with this suffering of my mind, because I am its locus. Therefore, O Mādhava, considering me to be your own servant, please graciously tame my mind by attaching it to your feet with the tether of firm bhakti to you." So it's as if the person is like on the back of the horse, so to speak, and being taken all around, a bit like that verse in the Upanishads, which compares the person to a passenger on a chariot being led by the intellect and the reins of the mind, the horses of the senses, so to speak, running all about and, going for a wild ride such that it's, experiencing great discomfort. So something like that, the person or the jivatma is being taken along by this mind and also suffering. So to end that suffering, there needs to be something imposed upon the mind such that it no longer runs after all these sense objects, which the implication being engages in all types of actions other than bhakti, which perpetuate its entanglement and suffering and saṁsāra. That needs to end, and the only way that can end is by taking up the path of bhakti, or performing actions that don't entangle one in samskara, but rather they liberate one from it. So this is touched on further in a few citations. The Shrutis indicate in Srimad Bhagavatam, in the Shruti Stuti, that the primary means by which Bhagavan fulfills prayers, such as this by the author, is by assuming the form of Sri Guru and teaching bhakti to himself. So this is a verse which Jiva Goswami cites in the Sandarbhas as the principal reason for why it's important to have a guru, or what it is that a guru can help someone with that they're unlikely, if not entirely unable, to achieve on their own. So, I'll just read the translation. It says, "O unborn one," meaning O Bhagavan, "those here in the ocean of samsara who abandon the feet of Guru and endeavor to subdue the extremely volatile stallion of the untamed mind, even with conquered senses and vital errors, become afflicted by the method, that is, by the very method, whatever it may be, that they take up to try to tame the mind, and beset with hundreds of adversities, just as merchants who have not procured a helmsman are so afflicted at sea." So if you've ever been on a boat in the open ocean, then you know how turbulent it can be, how seasick you can become, and how never-ending the turbulence and the disquiet or lack of peace one can feel out in the never-ending oscillations of the ocean's surface. So when one has and on top of that, if one has no captain or one's no helmsman, such that one's boat is just aimlessly moving throughout a space like that, one will very much feel a sense of hopelessness and misery. So if some merchants who need to get to some place and are also driven by the rajas of trying to make money, or perhaps trying not to lose money if they've already made certain investments, then on top of that, to go through all the turbulence of being on the ocean and not having a captain who can actually get them where they need to go, this is, an extremely unpleasant situation. In other words, it implies a highly discomforting situation of the body as well as a highly discomforting situation of the mind. So here the analogy is given that a person who tries to tame the mind, which is like a volatile stallion, in other words, something that's very, very difficult to tame, without a captain, that is, without a guru, even if they have conquered senses and pranas, will find it very difficult and will still undergo adversities. So what you call the kaimutya, or the a fortiori implication is that, and if you don't have controlled senses and you don't have controlled pranas, then it's even more difficult for you. So in the ultimate import being that to accept a guru, to follow the guidance of the guru, to follow the path taught by the guru as it's laid out in the Shastra, this is the way to overcome the untamed mind, or the way to bring the mind under control. So we have a nice couple of comments from Samipad and Jiva Goswamipad on this verse. So this first one in particular, from Samipad, Gurunopadishta Bhagavad Bhajana Sukanubhuto tu Svata eva Mano-nishchalam bhavati nanyateti bhavaha. That when experience of satisfaction occurs within the worship of Bhagavan, taught by the Guru, then steadiness of mind arises of its own accord, and not otherwise. This is the purport. So the mind runs towards satisfaction or pleasure, sukh. Jiva Goswami calls this the nirupadi prityaspada or premaspada. The unconditional object of affinity for every embodied being is pleasure or satisfaction. The mind can't do without it. So wherever it gets satisfaction, or the most satisfaction, that's where it keeps trying to go. So if one can experience satisfaction in bhajan, in the bhajan that one is taught by the Guru, in other words, in following the path of bhakti as the Guru teaches it, then the mind will become steady, because the implication is that the person is trying to follow the path of bhakti, but they're not feeling so much satisfaction in it because they don't have that much ruchi or that much taste for it yet. Their samskara for bhakti is not so deep, so they feel greater pleasure or significant levels of pleasure still in other non-bhakti related activities. So then the mind keeps trying to revert back over there. But when really one feels satisfaction in the path of bhajan taught by the Guru, in other words, once that vasana for bhakti becomes strong enough that the mind is getting nourished, it's getting the sukh that it can't live without there, then the mind will be steady. The mind won't go anywhere outside of that bhajan, because the thing that it's addicted to, if you will, it's getting it from there. And then, in that way, of its own accord, it becomes steady. In other words, at that stage, one doesn't have to continually with the intellect keep putting the mind back there. Rather, the mind will just stay there. So this is alluded to by Rupa Goswami in these stages of the self-manifestation of prema into the psyche that he describes in the well-known verse of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Shraddha Ata Sadhu Sangha Tata Bhajana Kriya, this set line of progression, where he explains that there's nishta, ruchi, asakti, and bhava. And there he defines this stage of ruchi as a state of taste, or a state which implies an experience of satisfaction in bhakti, or in one's worship. But he qualifies it as buddhi-purvaka. In other words, one has to use the intellect to bring the mind to it, and then there is this appreciation for it. But then Jiva Goswami, or rather in the commentary, explains this distinction, but at a higher stage, it becomes abudhi-purvaka, or it becomes svabhaviki. In other words, at a more intense stage, then the mind is just going there. It doesn't even require the intellect to prompt it to put its attention there. It just goes there. In other words, the samskara is so strong that it's just of its own accord sticking to that. So one way we can say that this statement of Samipad refers to that same dynamic that Rupa Goswami, that Jiva Goswami spell out in more detail in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And Jiva Goswami, he also has a comment on this same verse, which is a little different than Samipad's comment, but also adds some important detail. So he says, when knowledge of the path to Bhagavan arises through engagement in the process shown by Sri Guru of worship of Bhagavan, and when by his grace, that is the grace of Sri Guru, one is no longer overcome by adversity, then steadiness of the mind quickly comes about. This is the purport. So, when he says knowledge comes from the process, the idea is that there's some pre-existent knowledge of how to do the process or of what the path is, and then when one does the process, then one really realizes what the process is or what the path truly is. So they get the actual knowledge, if you will, as a result of doing the process. And they're able to successfully do the process when it's taught to them by the Guru, and by the grace of the Guru when they're able to overcome adversity, which essentially means the various anarthas in their mind. And elsewhere, Jiva Goswami explains that the great value in having a Guru is that the Guru can help one overcome anarthas that one otherwise on one's own accord cannot, or only with great difficulty, can ever overcome. So, as through the guidance, the support of the Guru, one overcomes one's anarthas, then one successfully does the process, and then one comes to real understanding of what the process or what the path is. And with that purification of the mind, with that clear realization of what is going on, then the mind becomes steady, or one succeeds in taming the stallion, if you will. So, understanding these points from our acharyas, if we look back at the verse under discussion, when he says, please hitch to the post of your feet the horse of my mind with the tether of bhakti, then we'll take it, what does that really translate to or spell out practically? It spells itself out to learning the path of bhakti that our Goswamis taught from a guru and practicing in our life. And by doing that, then this sadbhakti vasana, as it's in one place called by Rupa Goswami, this vasana for pure bhakti, this one-pointedness of desire upon bhakti and upon Bhagavan, grounded in the intent upon Krishna's satisfaction, what is called the Krishna Sukaika Tatparya, then when that vasana becomes principle, then that will act like a tether, or that will act like a tie that fixes the mind upon Bhagavan and allows it to run nowhere else. And when one reaches that state, then the mind no longer goes towards any other unfavorable objects, one no longer entangles oneself in saṁsāra, one becomes freely absorbed in the bliss of bhakti. So, in closing, this is a prayer in humility felt as a result of struggling with the untamed mind, struggling with the anarthas that one has in one's mind, and in that feeling of lowliness that emerges from the mistakes that one makes or the instability that one finds in one's mind, then this prayer to have or to be blessed with bhakti such that the mind can become one-pointedly fixed. This is what the poet is conveying. So, I'll move on to the next one. Next, the compiler cites an expression of humility arising from ascertainment of neglecting worship. I need an of Bhagavan, to be the cause of undergoing suffering. So on the one hand, if I had bhakti, I would become free from this suffering. And then, the corollary, if you will, is that means I understand that if I don't worship Bhagavan, I'm going to keep on suffering, or I'm going to just perpetuate my suffering by neglecting to worship Bhagavan. So the poem is as follows. Na dhyāto'si, na kīrtito'si, na manāg ārādhito'si, prabho. No janmāntara-gocare tava padāmbhoje cha bhakti kṛtā. Tenāhaṁ bahu-duḥkha-bhājanatayā, prāpto daśām īdṛśīṁ. Tvaṁ kāruṇya-nidhe vidhehi karunam, śrī-kṛṣna dine mayi. So he says, sorry, I'm just double checking that I don't have a typo here. I just can't see. One sec. Sorry. Yeah, I do. Okay. There we go. Neither have you been meditated upon, nor have you been praised, nor have you been worshipped even slightly by me at any time throughout my life. O Prabhu, nor at your lotus feet has any bhakti been offered by me in the course of any other birth. Thus being an object of profuse suffering, I have reached such a state. O reservoir of compassion, O śrī-kṛṣna, may you please bestow compassion upon my poor self. So he's saying, in this life I haven't worshipped you, and I don't think I worshipped you in past lives either. So, and I understand that is causing me to suffer in this world. So, O Krishna, I'm in a poor condition, a humble condition. Please bestow your grace, your compassion upon me. This is in gist what he says, so let's look at the implication. I have reached such a state. So it's a little bit cryptic. He just says, such a state. īdṛśīṁ. Sorry, same typos there. īdṛśīṁ, rather. daśām. So what is that state exactly? What is this such a state? The commentator takes it as follows. I have reached a most lamentable state wherein I am an object of profuse suffering, and therefore I have taken shelter in you. The mention of, quote, thus, prior to I have reached such a state, indicates the cause, meaning the author infers that he finds himself in a state of most lamentable suffering because he has neglected to take shelter in Bhagavan and engage in bhakti to him throughout the course of his present and past lives. Sri Jivapad explains the basis of this inference in Bhakti Sandarbha. So he's taking it that the absence of bhakti, or the neglecting to engage in bhakti, is what is leading him to go on in a state of perpetual suffering in saṁsāra. So there's a very nice section here from the beginning of the prakaran about Sharanagati in the Bhakti Sandarbha. I'll just read the English to keep it short. Where Jiva Goswami explains in gist, how is it that someone becomes a Sharanagata? Which, as we know from that section, is the prerequisite to becoming a Bhakta. Bhagavan does not recognize anyone to be his own or to be his Bhakta who's not a Sharanagata. So one is first of all a Sharanagata, and then on the basis of that and with aspiration for some specified form of bhakti, one may go about engaging in varieties of limbs of bhakti and in the company of particular sadhus who foster a particular bhav and so on and so forth. But what is it that brings the person out of this state of obliviousness and perpetual conditioning in samsara such that they become a Sharanagata? So Jiva Goswami frames this as follows. Being troubled by the fear, that is the suffering of samsara, caused by the enemies beginning with the Shadvarga, which is a term which literally means the group of six, but is a concise way of referring to desire, anger, greed, delusion, conceit, and envy. Sometimes those exact six are Sometimes there's a little bit of shifting in which is included. This is one common grouping. But essentially it just means all the types of anartas that exist in the mind. So being troubled by anger, by greed, by conceit, by envy, etc., one who is devoid of any other recourse, that is, one who feels oneself to have no shelter from such trouble, enters shelter, that is, takes shelter in Bhagavan. So when one feels that I will only continue to suffer as a result of having this desire and anger and greed and delusion, unless I take shelter in Bhagavan, there's no way to become free from these without taking shelter in Bhagavan. When one understands this, then what do? They take shelter. So this is one way that someone becomes a Sharanagata. They're in a state of trouble, and to become relieved of that trouble, they come to a shelter that can protect them from that trouble, namely Bhagavan. Then he gives a second option. As also does one whose sole desire is bhakti, being troubled by the obliviousness, that is forgetfulness of Bhagavan caused by them, by the aforementioned enemies, meaning one whose sole desire is bhakti takes shelter in Bhagavan for the sake of becoming free from the impediments to apt enactment of bhakti created by the Shadvarga, so that one can aptly engage in bhakti to Bhagavan. So as we discussed in regard to an earlier verse in this section with reference to some of the statements of Prahlad Maharaj, when Prahlad on the one hand says, I have no fear of anything in saṁsāra, and on the other hand says, I am very afraid, please save me, then, as it was explained by the commentators, he describes himself as fearful, not merely of discomfort or personal pain that he might undergo in the course of embodiment, but rather he's quote-unquote fearful of elements that are antithetical to bhakti, to association and to circumstances that are displeasing, are, rather what he called arochakatva, like, and having an absence of any perceived value or interest or relishability to a bhakta, and that create an influence upon one that is unfavorable to absorption in bhakti, that he has a problem with. So this is concisely also explained, you can say, by Jiva Goswami here in very little bit, concise way. It might be hard to catch, but by saying one whose sole desire is bhakti, right? He's giving this as a second category. So the first category, the people who took shelter in Bhagavan to get free from envy and greed and delusion and other types of suffering, that he's not calling as a bhakti matra kama or an akantik bhakta or a person trying to follow the path of uttama bhakti. That's just a person suffering, a little bit like the example of Gajendra mentioned by Rupa Goswami with reference to the Gita of 4 people who worship me, one is the one in distress. The person he's in distress, he looks to whoever can save him from distress. His goal at that moment is to get out of distress. So that's one way. Or a person whose only desire is bhakti also takes shelter in Bhagavan, but then here Jiva Goswami is saying, but what are they seeking shelter from? Right? So he doesn't say it's just the troubles of saṁsāra, but rather he says it's the trouble of vaimukya, or the trouble of an influence or the presence of what is antithetical to bhakti. So in other words, it's not that they're just trying to escape their suffering, but they're trying to get shelter from or trying to free themselves from the absence of bhakti or what is contrary to bhakti. So this is an important distinction. Then he goes on. The stage of, quote, being devoid of any other recourse, or ananya-gatitva, is seen furthermore to be of 2 types. It comes about, 1, by hearing and understanding explanation of the absence of any other shelter from the troubles one undergoes in saṁsāra apart from Bhagavan. And 2, by abandoning another in which one has somehow taken shelter for the sake of attaining relief from the trouble one is undergoing in saṁsāra, out of a great lack, out of a lack of great discrimination as to who is truly a capable shelter in this regard. That is, as a result of not having earlier understood that Bhagavan alone, and nothing and no one else, is truly capable of providing shelter to jivas in saṁsāra. So who comes to a shelter? Someone who's homeless goes to the homeless shelter, or someone who's in a house walks out of their house and comes to the homeless shelter. In other words, they're either not in a shelter and they come to the shelter, or they're in something that they took shelter in hoping it was shelter, but found that it's not actually sufficient shelter, and therefore come to another place that is shelter. So he gives examples from Bhagavatam of both of these. Being devoid of any other recourse, coming about by the former, that is, by the first aforementioned means, that is, by explanation of the absence of any real shelter other than Bhagavan, is described in the Bhagavad 10.3.27 as follows. Quote, scared of the serpent of death, and fleeing throughout all the planes that constitute this universe, a mortal cannot attain fearlessness anywhere. But upon reaching your lotus feet fortuitously, that is, by means of bhakti, somehow attained by the grace of a mahat. O foremost being, O Bhagavan, one rests peacefully, and death withdraws from one. So in other words, when one understands that if you're embodied, if you're in saṁsāra, you're subject to death, you're subject to embodiment, therefore you're subject to all the complications of embodiment, which entail some level of perpetual suffering. So the only way to ever become free from that is to take shelter in Bhagavan, to take shelter in He who exists beyond this whole realm of embodiment, and who has the power to also extract one from it. So this is one case, and the second case is described as follows. The state of being devoid of any other shelter coming about by the latter, that is, by the second aforementioned means, that is, by abandoning another in which one has unwisely taken shelter, is described by Bhagavan Śrī-kṛṣna himself to Uddhava as follows. Therefore, O Uddhava, abandoning injunctions and prohibitions, that is, the injunctions and prohibitions given in the Shruti and the Smriti, engagement and resignation, that is, the dharmas of a grihasta and of a sannyasi, and that which can be heard and that which has been heard, that is, all that pertains to such dharmas and the injunctions and prohibitions related to them in the Shastra, or alternately, all else that can be heard from Shastra, that is, all that is said in Shastra related to the Jnana-marg, you should take shelter exclusively in me alone, the self of all embodied beings, with the full existence of yourself. With me, that is, by thus becoming situated in my shelter, be completely fearless. So in both verses, there's this mention of fearlessness. This is the thread of Jiva Goswami's citations. So one is becoming fearless by giving up another thing that they took shelter in, namely the Shastra, in the general sense of the karma marg, and all the injunctions in the karma marg, or all the injunctions in the jnana marg that are explained and one thinks will lead them to a state of freedom from fear or freedom from suffering. And he's saying, no, only by taking shelter in Bhagavan, without the path of bhakti, it's not possible to become completely free from fear. So you'll become fearless only by this. And in the other case, death pervades every loka within the Brahmanda, whether you're in Satyaloka or Svargaloka or here or there, what have you, you can't escape the snake of death. So only by taking shelter in Bhagavan can one become free from that fear. Can one think that they're connected with a process and a person and a prospect of immortality. So by either of these means, one feels oneself to have no other shelter, or feels oneself to be in a situation in which they will perpetually undergo fear, unrest, and suffering, and therefore take shelter in Bhagavan as the means of becoming free from that. So the whole purpose of this citation is to explain how in this verse under discussion, the poet is saying, I realize that I reached this state of suffering because of neglecting you. Because I didn't take shelter in you, I understand that that's why I am going on suffering in all these ways. So I've got a few other citations in this regard. The compiler also cites the following verse in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which illustrates how a jiva can become so severely deluded by the Shadvarga, that is, by desire and so forth, that they utterly neglect to engage in bhakti to Bhagavan, and rather, in many cases, commit sin and offenses to Bhagavan, such that they cause an indefinite perpetuation of their bondage and suffering in saṁsāra. So this is a verse that came earlier in Madhya Lila 22, where a poet says, how often have how many dictates of desire and so forth not been obeyed by me? It cannot be said, because I feel I have acted under their wicked dictates constantly for as long as I can remember. Still, neither their compassion for me, nor shame, nor pacification have ever come about on their part or my part. Now thereafter, O Lord of the Yadus, having attained proper understanding, I have abandoned them and come to you, the shelter free from fear. Please engage me in your personal service. So the same thread is continuing, right? He's seeking freedom from fear, or he's seeking a shelter that can protect him from fear, and he's realizing that that's only in Bhagavan. As long as he remains subject to the Shadvarga, he's never going to get out of that. So, with this sense, he now takes shelter in Bhagavan and seeks to be engaged in service to Bhagavan. So the quote, proper understanding, or sat buddhi, spoken of in this verse is the understanding that far better than serving the wicked masters of desire and so forth is serving Sri Bhagavan, who is not devoid of compassion, shame, and pacification, and thus a source of fear, as desire and so forth are, but rather is profoundly compassionate, highly considerate, easily pleased by even a little sincere service, and thus a shelter wherein one can be completely free from fear. When one acquires such proper understanding, one takes shelter in Bhagavan and prays to him to be engaged in service. The author of the verse under discussion's usage of the address, O Prabhu, that is, O Master, conveys such understanding of Sri Bhagavan's being most worthy of worship and the compulsoriness of worship of Sri Bhagavan. Quote, meditation and so forth upon you who are supremely worthy of worship is certainly necessary to perform, and because of my transgression in neglecting to do that, I am an object of all this suffering. Sri Sanatan Pad cites the following verse in Hari Bhakti Vilas to establish the compulsoriness of bhakti to Bhagavan. Quote, as long as a human being on earth does not honor, that is, does not take shelter with bhakti, in the one essence, the rasa of the exceptional nectar of the tidings of Vishnu Bhakti, then one undergoes the sufferings of the lashings of hundreds of infirmities, deaths, and births begotten by numerous bodies. That is, the suffering of saṁsāra is extinguished only when one attains Vishnu Bhakti, which is based in essence on taste for discussion of Bhagavan, and thus attaining Vishnu Bhakti is compulsory for all living beings. So this is a verse that we often hear from Baba, and this point I added here is also from a Tika of Jiva Goswami early on in the Bhagavatam, where he describes that all types of bhakti are essentially based on having affinity for or taste for discussion of Bhagavan, because one wouldn't be inclined to do anything else if they hadn't first of all heard something about who Bhagavan is and appreciated that. So this verse represents the path of bhakti as a whole by speaking specifically about, quote, honoring this essence, which is the rasa of the exceptional nectar of the tidings of Vishnu Bhakti. So unless and until one acquires some taste for that kṛtā, some kotha ruchi, as it's called in simple terms, then one will go on suffering birth, death, and all sorts of difficulties in body after body after body. So this quote-unquote compulsoriness of bhakti is in the sense that unless you accept this, there's no way to become free from perpetual transmigration and all the difficulties that it creates. So it's necessary in that sense, from this general analytical perspective. So this verse further confirms the idea implied here in the verse under discussion, where he says, I've reached such a state because I've always neglected engaging in bhakti to you in this life and my last life. So this is, here's a verse saying, as long as you don't engage in bhakti, you carry on suffering. So, he says, thus, or now I've come to realize this situation, or why I'm in this condition. So he prays. The address in the verse under discussion, O reservoir of compassion, kāruṇya-nidhe, alludes to the author's desire to be forgiven by Bhagavan and spared of all the suffering he is undergoing. Quote, please now disregard those faults of mine by virtue of your noble disposition, bestow compassion upon me, and certainly therewith restrain Maya, your maidservant, who causes profuse affliction for wayward wrongdoers like myself. This is how the commentator takes the purport. But we'll just add to that, in accord with the discussion of Prahlad Maharaj's prayers in the commentary on verse 60, the compassion of Śrī-kṛṣna desired by the author in the verse under discussion is not merely that of Śrī-kṛṣna removing whatever suffering the author is undergoing, but rather the compassion of engaging the author in service to himself, as was prayed for in the aforesaid verse from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and therewith enabling the author to remain absorbed in bhakti to himself, that is, to not be excessively troubled by the obstacles to bhakti caused by the Shadvarga, since those whose sole desire is bhakti take shelter in Bhagavan and seek freedom from such obstacles specifically for the sake of engaging in bhakti to Bhagavan, as was indicated by Sri Jivapad in the aforecited passage from Bhakti Sandarbha. So we dealt with this problem, if you will, earlier, that in some cases it can seem like bhaktas have a desire for moksha, even though so central to the core ethos of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is that the path of Uttama Bhakti is free from having any desire for moksha. But yet you see in the Bhagavatam, and you see even here in this compilation by guess who, the author of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, a number of these prayers where someone is praying, or it seems as if they're praying to be free from suffering or free from saṁsāra, or which implies or alludes to having a desire to be for moksha. So again and again, we have to always in those contexts understand that when someone appears to be praying from freedom from suffering, or praying for freedom from the difficulties or the hardships that they're undergoing, the implication is that their purpose of that prayer is to engage in bhakti, and the things that they're trying to become free from are things that are impediments to engagement in bhakti, not an independent notion of personal comfort or personal enjoyment. So that was demonstrated, as we did before, with tikas of Jiva Goswami and Chakravarti Pad from the Bhagavatam on the Prahlad Charit. So just reminding and threading together that point in this context as well. So I think that's all we have time for today. I thought we might get through a couple more, but we'll get to them in the next class. So we're most of the way now through this Dainyokti Prakaran. We have a couple of other verses, and then the last one is the fifth verse of Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So we'll give a little extra detail. We'll look at a little more in-depth discussion of that verse. And then we'll come to the following prakaran, the Bhakta Nishta, or the expressions of the Bhakta's fixity, or their bold adherence to Bhakti and to Bhagavan. So if anyone has any comments, corrections, questions, or other feedback, you're welcome to share. Yes?
Is it me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Pranam Zandavat. And I have just a few minutes to express what I want to say. Okay, so I may not have time for like question answer, but if you can just comment on what I just will say, I will just keep quiet because I'm at work. The main thread through this presentation was fear that stand out very strongly, and I started contemplating how fear plays a very important role in life of jiva, condition, not condition, like across, and just stun myself. Oh my God, this is really the existence, because in the basic level, jiva is fearful of saṁsāra. And that's a sign of lack of sharanagati. It's a sign of godlessness. Then when Jiva realizes, okay, let me take shelter of Bhagavan because I'm too much suffering, then he takes shelter of Bhagavan, that's sharanagati. But within the sharanagati, there is also fear of losing bhakti if you have one, or you experience something. There's fear of losing bhakti, that's another fear. And then even parikaras, they in fear for Krishna's safety. On all levels, fear plays a very important role to direct jiva to, even it's a part of, I think it's part of existence, because and just looking from the perspective of just the conditioned soul like myself, like kind of practitioner of bhakti as myself, I would say that you either suffer all the time. There's suffering in material life, and there's suffering in bhakti. To say that bhakti is not, you take shelter of Bhagavan, there's no suffering, I think it's theoretical, it's okay, I accept it, because there's some sense of relief, of understanding, yes, Bhagavan is there, but still, you are a conditioned soul. Jiva means conditioned soul. You're still under, living the body, which is getting sick, the mind gets some scars triggered from away 100 billion years ago, that happened and just popping up like that. So many things happen in the life of jiva, even if jiva is trying to be sharanagati. There's like fear. You cannot escape that. So I think from my angle of practice is that simply tolerating the state of fear, meaning that Bhagavan is always there, and you may externally experience suffering. So what? That just basically have this attitude. So what? It's not a big deal, because everything is, the whole concept is to make you fearful. It's like a horror movie going on in Jagat, But if you don't take part in this movie, just basically a standbyer that, the suffering rubs off you, but you don't make big deal of it. You just keep going with your little faith you have, little sadhana that you have, if you can, because some devotees don't have much time for sadhana. And I think that's just the not, it's not a cruising, but sort of like attitude towards the whole concept of devotional / material life. That way of basically being very tolerant to surroundings, knowing that Bhagavan is behind everything. So, again, it's just this motto, like, in your mind, like, what the heck, it's there, what's a big deal? So, but that contradicts with what you just said, that, out of fear, devotee takes full shelter, and it's just, there's a kind of drama going on, of this fear and calamity, saṁsāra, and then only if you surrender to Bhagavan, then everything is removed. So, the presentation that you gave, it shows that, this black and white kind of, but actually, in reality, if you analyze the real life, it's all in grace, and depending on one's own samskaras, one's own sharanagati attitudes, that one really can mitigate and move on, cruise the complexities of existence as a devotee, a practitioner, I would say. Is it not? So I was just like, I left it. I will leave it in the ether. Just if you want to pick up on this, or just whatever. I just want to express that what's my thought is after listening to this class. If you find it valuable, that's okay. That's nice to have some conversation. Otherwise, if it's something that I said is completely wrong, not sedantic, then please correct. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I'll just say a few things that come to mind. Maybe it'll sync with something you said, just casually. And what comes to my mind is that there's a discussion taken up in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu about quote unquote dukkha or suffering. And bhaya or fear is generally classified as a type of suffering or dukkha. So there, Rupa Goswami explains that it's observed in Leela that so many parikaras of Bhagavan in the course of experiencing bhakti rasa are experiencing bhaya or fear. So how is it that they're said to be experiencing something that's blissful or joyful and wonderful and perfect and spiritual, but yet there's still fear, or there's still this form of suffering in it? So I won't go into the whole analysis that he does, but in gist he says that quote unquote fear or suffering is actually a form of ananda, or a form of bliss, that it's actually, because its central object is Krishna, who is, the Visheshya bliss, or who is, the entity we call joy or bliss or happiness, then even fear based or related to him is also something that is meant to be understood as a type of ananda, or a type of bliss, because it is actually experienced to be such on the whole. So one way we can look at the difference between worldly life and the life of a bhakta, and whether it's a bhakta like a parikara, or even a lesser bhakta, that in either case they're still going to experience fear. But one type of fear is going to be asar, or it's not going to have any meaningful substance to it, but the other is going to have sar in it, or there's going to be ultimately spiritual bliss and spiritual substance to that experience of fear, both during it and in the unfolding stages when again there is union, or again there is meeting, or again there is another state of mind comes in which one feels a sense of connection. So, for example, just in the Sandarbha classes this week, we were hearing about prema vaichitya, in which, in the context of Madhura Rasa, Partikaras experience separation or vipralamba from Krishna even while being physically in his presence, as a result of an aberration of mind that comes about from being so minutely focused upon certain qualities that he has that one loses awareness that one's actually in his personal presence. And then there's this experience of separation, which contains, or is, in one sense, has an element of fear in it, that one is not with, or one has lost that object that is supremely dear to oneself. So, in that context, this idea of prema vaichitya is, a wonderful way in which extraordinary leelas are nourished and unfold and result in, profound experiences or bliss for Krishna and Radharani and their Sakhis and so forth. So I just refer to all this to say that that from a broad perspective, we can say that there will always be some type of fear, but there's desirable fear and undesirable fear. And then you might say in the middle ground, there is these statements like the one we talked about before of Prahlad, where he says, I'm not afraid of anything here in the of the Vaitarani, or in the world of saṁsāra. There's this certain peace and confidence that one has in trusting in Bhagavan's shelter, Bhagavan's arrangements, that free one from that undesirable or that essenceless, empty type of fear, and that enable one to also experience this positive or enriching, if you will, type of fear or threat of absence, if you will. So this is what comes to my mind, that there is a place for bhaktas to say that they're fearless. There's also a place to say that they do feel fear in connection with their ishta, and both are, rich, relishable and valuable aspects of things. So anyway, that's what comes to my mind on the topic. So I don't know, my connection may have dropped out here over the last couple of minutes. I'm not sure, but whatever the case may be, I'll sign off here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.